네, 첫 번째 기조연설은 고든 브라운 전 영국 총리님을 연사로 모시고 세계 경제 위기를 타개하기 위해 국제 공조를 어떻게 강화할 것인가를 주제로 강연을 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. Now, Mr. Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of UK, will deliver a keynote speech. Mr. Brown, please. 여러분, 고든 브라운 전 영국 총리님을 단상으로 모시겠습니다. 박수 부탁드립니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I say, first of all, what a privilege it is to be in Seoul, in Korea, and to be at this Human Resources Forum. And I want, first of all, to congratulate the President of the Forum, President Kim, President of the Korea Economic Daily News, for an innovation in creating a forum that is now a landmark event, not just in Korea and in this continent, but recognized as a very important event around every continent in the world. And I want to say on behalf of my fellow speakers, guests from America, Professor Shapiro and Professor Kruger, very distinguished academics this morning, and myself, that it is a privilege to pay tribute to the success story of the Republic of Korea. Over these last 50 years, to have moved from a position where you had only 12% of the per capita income of the United States of America to a position now where you're one of the leading economies of the world, one of the high-income economies, one, as you've just heard from Minister Lee in his excellent speech, one of the economies of 7 with 50 million people and incomes per capita of above 20,000 per head. And now to be thinking not simply of the success that you have had, but how you can transform yourself for the future. Success in shipbuilding, success in cars, success in mobile phones, success in computers and information technology, and now considering how you can have success for the future, not only in these industries, but in health and education, in biotechnology, in green industries, is a testimony to the resilience of the people of this country, and you are a model to whom the rest of the world looks for inspiration. And I believe that your status as a country has never been greater. And as I said last night, to have won on Saturday the international recognition of being the host for the new Climate Change Green Fund, which will be in Korea, to have hosted the G20 in such a successful way in 2010, the Nuclear Security Forum, and of course in sport, to have been so successful with the World Cup and now with the Winter Olympics in 2018, and of course, as my children tell me well, the Korean wave of artistic success and culture that is sweeping the world. You should be very proud of the achievements of this great country, and I want to acknowledge them this morning. Now, you may ask why it is 4 years after the world's financial recession in 2008, why 4 years on we are still in a position where there is uncertainty about the world economy, where Europe, or much of it, is in recession, where America is enjoying sluggish growth, where the impact of that is now affecting the growth of Asian economies who export to Europe and America, where there is still a sense of financial vulnerability in many of our banks and financial institutions. You may wonder why it is that 4 years after these traumatic events that hit the world, starting in America in 2008, why we have not done better in resolving these issues, and why people do not feel as confident, particularly in the Western countries, but around the world, about the future as they should be, given the pace of technological advance and given what we know, what we are capable of both producing and creating in the world. And there is a tendency to blame this on the politicians. Politicians have made mistakes. And in Europe you will find, and I'm one of the victims, that almost every single government has been thrown out of power since the economic crisis. It is said of finance ministers, and I used to be one, that there are only two kinds of finance minister in Europe. There are those who fail, and there are those who get out just in time. It is also said of politicians in Europe and elsewhere, in the words of Shelley, the great poet, that they lost the art of communication but not, alas, the gift of speech, that they say too much without having a great deal to say that makes sense. And Churchill, whom I quoted last night, who was one of my predecessors as Prime Minister of Britain, said in the 1930s about a similar economic crisis, he said that politicians, he said, were resolved to be irresolute, they were adamant for drift, they were solid for fluidity, and they were all-powerful for impotence. And that is how he explained the failure to deal with the economic crisis of the time, a lack of political leadership. I want to suggest to you, and this is the gist of my remarks when I talk about the important lessons we learn, that while we can complain about the failure of political leadership, there are far bigger forces at work that are transforming our world before our eyes. And when historians look back on the period from 2008 to 2012, and perhaps look back at the decade that we are about to have, they will say that we are undergoing bigger changes in economics and in our society than at any time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and perhaps even bigger changes than happened then. And it is in this context that I want to look at the challenges that this conference sets about the future of education and how we set in place the best measures to make for successful and fulfilling economies in the future. For 150 years, Europe and America dominated the world economy. They produced the majority of the world's goods. They manufactured most of the world's products. They were responsible for most of the world's trade. They engineered most of the world's investment, and they certainly consumed most of the world's goods. And for nearly 2 centuries, therefore, Europe and America dominated the world economy. But in 2010, for the first time, these two continents between them were responsible for only just around 40 to 45% of the world's output, responsible for just 40% of the world's investment, responsible for just 45% or so of the world's trade, and of course responsible for just over 40% of the world's manufacturing. And it's hardly surprising these continents with 10% of the population could never have more than 50% of the world's output and the world's investment forever. But this is a significant change that after 150 years, we have to recognize not only the rise of Korea and the rise of Japan and the rise of China and the rise of India, but a transformation so that we have a multipolar, a multi-balanced world economy for the future. And the second change is now underway, but it is as equally important as what happened in the last 20 years, and it affects us all. In 2010, Europe and America produced and manufactured and traded for the first time less than 50% of the world's goods and services, but it was still responsible for more than 50%, 55%, perhaps even more than that when the final figures are available, of the world's consumption, of the world's consumer spending. So we had the West responsible for less than half of the world's output, but responsible for more than half of the world's consumer spending. And this is what will change over the next 10, 15 years. The growth of the Asian middle class, 2 billion people now, 4 billion people by the 2020s, a consuming power, a consumer power that will buy not just cars and technology and computers, but want to own homes and will become a very, very important part driving the world economy forward. So, as some people have said, by the early 2020s, 40% of all consumer spending will be in Asia, 20% only in America. America, for many, many years, the world's largest consumer market, the largest single market, only half the size of the Asian consumer market. Germany, 4%, as against Asia's 40%. Great Britain, my country, 3%. And this will be the changing balance of consumer spending as the world economy, 30 trillion in 2000, 60 trillion in 2010, anything between 100 and 120 trillion by 2025, the massive amount of additional consumer spending in the emerging markets, but particularly, of course, in this continent of Asia. And that is the second great change that is underway, but of course not yet complete, and indeed we are in the transition to it. The third change will, of course, be a shifting pattern of the world's wealth and income, as gradually the old wealth and power that comes from wealth in the West will be replaced by a far more balanced distribution of wealth and income across the world. But that will take many decades for it to come to fruition. And so you ask yourself then, in this new world, are the big economies, those economies far bigger than Korea, far bigger than the United Kingdom, are those big economies going to be the dominant economies? Are they, as they produce and then consume, going to be so dominant that smaller economies will not have the same ability to move forward as perhaps they had even in the past? And my answer is no. My answer is, in this new world where we are seeing a shift in the balance of productive power and a massive shift in the balance of consumer spending power, a massive increase in the size of the world economy and the wealth of the economy as a whole, the economies that are going to do well are the economies that are innovative and are at the head of new technology, the economies that have skilled workforces and can therefore produce for this new market, the economies that break through what has often been called the middle income trap, where people are caught in low-paid manufacturing jobs and unable to make the transition to the capital-intensive, technology-intensive, highly skilled economies that will do best in the future. And I believe it is economies like yours, and hopefully economies that can follow what you are doing, that have got this huge chance to benefit from what is effectively a doubling of the consumer market over the next 15 years, and the rise of a middle class right across the world that wishes to benefit from the consumer advances that have been made in recent years and will continue to be made by huge developments in new technology in the future. First, of course, research and development will matter, and those countries that can lead at the technological frontier will make the difference. And of course, your decision to double your expenditure on research and development, double the number of people who are qualified technically and scientifically, focus your new research budgets on basic research, that will make a huge difference. And the intensity of research and development in a modern economy will be a decisive factor in the ability to break through into new markets. Apple has just produced a new product yesterday, the micro tablet. I understand that if you look at the price of that product, only $5 from that product will come in profits to the manufacturer, but nearly $100 will come in profits to the designer. And therefore, those people who have the creative ideas and the innovative talents and therefore get the benefit from the value added that comes from the design and the intellectual capital that goes into that product are going to be beneficiaries in the future. And as you here and as other countries develop that technological capacity to invent and to innovate, then you will be the greatest beneficiaries of the future growth in markets. The second aspect of this is, of course, creativity itself. I was in India a few months ago, and the Indian trade minister, as you probably would expect, was being quite skeptical of what the Chinese economic success was. And he told me a story. He said he'd gone to China when it was snowing, and he had no overcoat. And he went into one of the international shops in China to buy an overcoat because of the snow. And he went in and he found a cashmere coat that he thought was very suitable for the occasion of having to survive the bad weather. And he said he would buy it because it looked to him very reasonably priced. And then he said to the shop assistant, but where is the label? Where is the make? Where is the tag showing who made the coat? And the shop assistant said to him, well, which label do you want? We will give you Armani, we will give you Dior, we will give you Burberry, we will give you any make you want. And it was his point to emphasize that it is imitation that can take you so far, but if you're going to be really successful, it's creativity in design and in intellectual progress in making products and building services. But of course, the third aspect of this, research and development, emphasis on creativity and design, is education. And I do applaud, as I said to the President when I met him yesterday, your Prime Minister today, and the excellent speech made by your Education Minister, the efforts you're making in education. I think we're learning, and I am now the UN Global Envoy, Special Envoy on Global Education. The lessons we're learning everywhere are fourfold about education. One is teachers do matter. So whether it's university lecturers or school teachers, the quality of teachers is absolutely critical. The second thing we're learning is leadership matters. In a school or any educational organization, you can have good teachers, but unless you also have good leadership, you will not succeed as well as you should. And the third thing that we're learning is that, of course, the critical faculties, developing the critical faculties matters. And as the Education Minister said only a few minutes ago, if you can develop the creativity of a child, their basic inventiveness, tap that potential that is in them, then not just rote learning, but creativity of the child is going to be important to the educational success they have. And the final point is we're learning also how we apply technology to education is going to be crucial in the future. Some people think of a teacher as the sage on the stage, the person who lectures to the audience. But perhaps we should also think of the teacher as the guide by your side, the tutor, the coach that uses technology to best effect so that we bring out the best in the pupil and we bridge the gap between what they are and what they have it in themselves to become. So here we are, learning right across the world lessons from your Korean success. But here we also are plotting the future. If we are to succeed as you plan to succeed in biotechnology, nanotechnology, in the new industries associated with healthcare generally, and of course in what you have now done in climate change and new low-carbon technologies, then we need to show that research and development, the emphasis on creativity, and the investment in education, not simply producing a large number of people without recognizing the vocational importance of the skills that they have, that is going to be crucial to the future as well. But my main point today is this, and this is why the title of the lecture is that it is. There are limits to what any one country can now achieve in the modern world. There are limits that have been placed by the failure of international cooperation or its weakness on what can be achieved. Look at the situation now. We have in the world today relatively low inflation. We have a surplus of savings around the world, so there is no shortage of liquidity. We have underused capacity in the world economy, but we cannot get the level of growth even when 200 million people are unemployed around the world, and even when 80 million young people are unemployed. We are seeing ourselves in the last year downgrading our estimates for growth around the world, the weakness of Europe and America now affecting Asia. And I want to suggest to you that there's a structural problem here that can only be dealt with by us all supporting higher levels of international cooperation. Look at it this way. If the majority producers are in one part of the world and the majority consumers are in another part of the world, what is going to persuade the producers that these consumers are going to buy their goods in a situation of international instability? What happens when the American consumer with high levels of personal debt, The European consumer worried because the banks in Europe are still weak, because there is low growth and low competitiveness in Europe, and therefore there is uncertainty there. What happens when they feel they cannot afford to buy goods from around the world, and it affects the export potential of the Asian economy? What happens if America cannot increase its exports because the East, I mean Asia in this case, is unable to buy from them because they are fearful of a further downturn? And what we've got as a result of an unbalanced world economy, where the majority of production is in one place and the majority of consumption is in another place, is a loss of confidence about how we can build growth for the future. And unless there is macroeconomic coordination of policy, unless the big powers and the big countries and the continents can get together, probably through the G20 and the IMF, then I believe we will continue to have relatively lower growth than the world economy ought to have over these next few years. In other words, there is no structural barrier in inflation or commodity prices or in the loss or the lack of savings or in the overcapacity of certain sectors of the economy. There is no structural barrier to higher world growth. What there is lacking is a confidence that if America bought from Asia, it could afford it. If Asia produced for America, and Asia then increased its consumer spending, particularly, of course, in China, which is far more capable of increasing consumer spending than any economy at the moment, we could have higher levels of growth around the world. Now, this is a failure of international cooperation. In 2009, we held the G20 in London. We decided to take action to prevent a global recession becoming a global depression. And we injected around $1 trillion into the world economy to make sure that that happened in Korea in particular. China also had a fiscal stimulus that was important to that recovery. But in 2009, we also agreed that we would rebuild the financial system. And we also agreed we would have a global growth pact. So we agreed measures that would stimulate the world economy, not just in the short term, but build confidence about how it would do better in the longer term. And we did not implement these measures. There has been a failure in international cooperation on macroeconomic policy, on rebuilding the financial system, where we have a series of national financial rules rather than global financial rules. And there has been a failure of international cooperation on trade, where although we have excellent bilateral trade deals between Korea and the European Union, Korea and America, there has been no world trade agreement, and there is therefore a danger of a rise in protectionism across the world over these next few years. And there's been a further failure, and that is in climate change agreements, because the Copenhagen talks, which could have produced a climate change framework within which there would be a clear carbon price and the development of renewable industries could proceed across the world with a high level of investment, that did not happen, and there is still an uncertainty that prevents the development of low-carbon technologies because people are unsure what the market price is likely to be at the end of the day. And I would suggest to you that all of us should think about how, in the next 10 years, the world economy would better develop if not only individual countries like yours and mine concentrated on building their comparative advantage through education, research, and innovation, but also were part of a cooperative venture where we tackled what were global problems and tried to find global solutions. On macroeconomic policy, I suggest that there be a global growth pact, where China in particular agrees it would expand its consumer spending, the West would agree that it would increase its infrastructure investment, probably done by the private sector so that we did not have a huge public sector burden of debt as a result of it, but overall an injection of resources into the economy which made possible a higher level of global growth. On climate change, I believe we need a framework, even if we cannot get a treaty, that is negotiated between the major countries that will give us a sense of how renewables investment can move forward over the next few years, and companies then would have some certainty about how low carbon technologies and the speed at which they could be adopted was going to happen. On trade, I believe we need one further attempt. The failure of the last time was India and America could not agree to get a trade deal that is at least one that gives us the chance to have greater certainty that there will be limited protectionism in the world in the years to come. And on financial stability, we need a common set of rules for transparency and accountability of our financial institutions, common rules about liquidity and capital ratios, because if we don't have these, the next time there is a financial crisis, and there will be one at some point in the future, people will ask, why did we not learn the lessons of 2008, that we are all part of a global financial system, and if we're part of that global financial system, there must be at least a set of minimum standards that apply across the world. So my point to you this morning is that there is a ceiling beyond which all of us as individual nations cannot move above unless we have a better degree of international cooperation than we had in the past. We all know that we're in a world economy that is dominated by the global flows of money and of services and of goods. That has been to the huge benefit of the countries of this world that have exposed themselves to international trade as you have done. But we also know at the moment that we are operating at an imperfect and inadequate level of cooperation to achieve the levels of growth and, of course, long-term investment in low-carbon and environmental products and, of course, financial stability that is an essential element for every business represented here as they move forward. In 1961, John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States of America and gave a famous inauguration address. And last year, to commemorate the 50 years since that, I was invited as part of a group of international leaders to re-record that famous inaugural address with one person from each country taking one of the phrases and repeating them so that we had a tape that compiled different voices in this famous address. And you know the words, some of you, of these great statements made in 1961. The torch has passed to a new generation, about how a new generation, and this is happening again, can lead the world forward. Never negotiate from fear, never fear to negotiate, something that was tough about diplomacy, but about the necessity of diplomacy in this great world. We cannot save the few who are rich if we cannot help the many who are poor. A testimony, as we've heard earlier this morning, to the need to feel strongly about inequalities and injustices that can be remedied, not just in our own countries, but across the world. Ask not what America can do for you, ask what you can do for America. But then he went on to say, ask not what America can do for you, ask what you can do for the world. Richard Nixon was his defeated presidential candidate, and he was asked, which of these great phrases would you like to have given? And he said, of all the phrases in Kennedy's speech, he said, the only one I'd like to have given was, I hereby accept the office of President of the United States of America. But you know, the great phrases in Kennedy's speech about international cooperation still ring very true today. He went on to give an address in Philadelphia when he said the Americans had a declaration of independence. He said there now should be a declaration of interdependence, that we are all part of one world, small countries, large countries, countries that are developing countries and countries that are developed world. And I think this is the message that I bring to you today. In Europe, we have major problems. It perhaps will take a decade to sort out these problems because of the failure of the banking system, the lack of competitiveness in Europe, and the difficulties we have had of managing a euro currency which was not built from the strongest of foundations. But Europe can play a bigger part in the world economy, as can America and Asia, if we recognize that there are global problems associated with achieving the highest levels of growth, the best environmental standards, and of course the strongest foundations of financial stability. If we learn these lessons from the financial crisis, we have yet, in my view, to fully learn that we work best when we work together, then I believe that we can solve many of the problems that still face us at the moment, build a stronger and more resilient economy for the future, and achieve what surely is the potential of this decade to create a larger global middle class with opportunities to free themselves from poverty, and to do so, most of all, by the opportunities that come in breaking the cycle of poverty from what you have emphasized most of all in your country, the importance of education. Thank you very much.
네, 고든 브라운 총리님 감사합니다. Thank you very much. Please stay. Please remain the stage. Thank you. 네. 이어서 주미대사 주영대사를 역임하신 이태식 SK에너지 고문님께서 사회화 대담을 진행해 주시겠습니다. 이태식 SK에너지 고문님을 단상위로 모시겠습니다. 여러분 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 그럼 이태식 고문님 부탁드리겠습니다.
Well, Prime Minister Brown, it was an excellent presentation on world economy. It's rather interesting to ask ourselves why this tectonic shift or change has taken place in the global economy in the past 10 or 20 years or so. And we have this imbalance between West and East, as you have mentioned, in terms of production capacity, in terms of consumer spending and so forth. This big change, where do you ascribe the reason for this big change?
It was always inevitable that Europe and America, with the small part of the world population that they have, would be caught up and would become a less big part of the world economy. So it was an inevitable part of the process of economic change that is taking place around the world. But the significance of what's happening is, I think, sometimes overlooked. 10 years ago, America could drive the world economy forward. So America could decide it would spend more, it would inject resources into its economy, it would expand demand, and the whole of the world would benefit from that. It is not in a position to do that now. America is constrained by the personal levels of debt and borrowing, its housing market, and therefore there is a limit to how much the American consumer can expand his or her spending. 10 years from now, the Asian consumer may be able to drive the whole world economy forward. And that is a huge possibility given the expansion of the Asian middle class. But in the 10 years from now to then, we have a problem, and that is what I'm trying to identify the need for coordinated global action to resolve. If no one economy can now drive the whole world economy forward, then we need cooperation between the different parts of the world economy to make it work. So I suppose, Ambassador, and I respect your great expertise in this matter because you have served your country so well in embassies abroad. I think that there's an inevitable process at work. It can be speeded up or slowed down by a number of different forces. But at the moment, the worrying element of it is that because no one economy can drive the world forward, we do need that cooperative agreement that has been missing in the last few years.
We had two crises in the past 15 years. First, 1997-1998 Asian crisis, and then 2008 financial crisis. When the first crisis erupted, what the West was doing, and the West had enough lessons from the first crisis, was it applied to the second crisis so that you could manage the crisis rather well? Or the first lesson was not fully understood by the West?
My view is, I traveled around Asia in 1997, 1998, when I was chairman of the G8 group of finance ministers. And I visited Korea, I visited Thailand, I visited Japan, I visited all the countries that were affected by the Asian crisis. And then I tried to persuade my colleagues in the G7 at that time, it then became the G8, that we had to do something quite different. We had to create a global financial stability board. We needed an early warning system to deal with financial crises. We needed better monitoring of the big financial institutions, greater transparency in the flow of information. I made a number of proposals and a number of speeches, one at Harvard University in 1998. We did set up what was called the Global Financial Stability Forum, but it was not an early warning system for the world economy. We did create the precedent where at every meeting of the IMF there was a report done on the risks and vulnerability to the world's economy, but we didn't quite appreciate all the factors that had to be examined and how risk had become concentrated in the world economy, how we'd seen the development of shadow banking institutions. None of that was properly appreciated. So we did not fully learn the lessons from the Asian crisis, which meant that we were not as well prepared as we should have been for the global financial crisis. My issue today, and the point I want to raise with you, have we learnt the lessons from the global financial crisis? You see, when I go around the world, I see America adopting its new standards for financial regulation. Europe adopting its new standards. In fact, Britain and Europe now and Switzerland have different standards. So you've got the British standard, the European standard, the Swiss standard. And therefore you do not have if you like, the common denominator of a set of global financial standards accepted by all financial centers, which would, in my view, be a necessary precondition of preventing a further crisis. So we didn't learn the lessons, yes, of the Asian financial crisis, and we should apologize for that. Have we yet learned the lessons of the global financial crisis? And could we genuinely say, when the next crisis came, that we'd taken every step possible to avoid a future crisis? I would say the answer is still no. We've got a lot to learn. And I think countries like your own country, Korea, the more you press the international community through the G20, in which you have a prominent role as the former chairman in 2010, but the more you press the G20 to develop common standards in financial reporting, but also in financial supervision, the better the world will be prepared for any future crisis that happen. The damage done by a financial failure was so great that we cannot afford to allow that to happen again without taking all possible measures to avoid it.
With respect to Eurozone crisis, what is at the heart of the issue? Why it's not going to be resolved rather soon?
I went to the first meeting of what is called the Euro group of leaders of government. You may find it surprising. The Euro was created in 1999. The finance ministers of the Euro group, which is a group of 17 countries, met every month. The leaders never met at all as a group. They held their first meeting actually in 2008, just as the crisis started. Britain, we were not a member of the Euro. We had just recapitalized our banks, recognized that the problems of the banks were lack of capital, and I was invited to this Eurogroup meeting. And I think I saw there what are the signs that I now see of the failure to solve the crisis in Europe. Nobody believed in Europe at the time that they had a banking crisis. They believed they had problems that arose from an American crisis. And I kept saying to my European colleagues, but our banks in Europe, the banks in Europe, are far more highly leveraged than the banks in America. Half of the subprime that was sold in America that caused much of the initial crisis in America had actually been sold on to European banks by Americans into Europe. So Europe had bad, toxic assets as well. And over the 4 years since the crisis in 2008, Europe has been very slow to clean up its banks. They have not injected enough new capital into them. They have not written off the toxic assets. There is a process of deleveraging going on, so they're not lending to business. The banks are one of the problems that are making it difficult for the economy to recover. Europe has also got another problem because it is not selling enough exports to the rising markets of the world, including your own. Only 7.5% of European exports go to China, India, Korea, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, the emerging market countries. And therefore, they do not have market position in some of the fastest growing markets of the world. And as a result, the European economy, which used to be 20% of the world economy, is now 18, and it will fall to 12, 11 in 10 years' time if nothing is done about it. So there is a competitiveness problem as well. And then there is the difficulty of the euro itself, because if you're part of the euro, you are constrained by having to adopt the same exchange rate, the same interest rate, rules against what you can borrow are being implemented within the European Union, but they cannot solve the problem of managing this area. There is no, until a few weeks ago, there was no lender of last resort. There is no system by which one decision maker is there to deal with fiscal problems that arise. And so we've created a monetary union without a fiscal union, without a political union, and only now we're trying to create a banking union. And so the constraint that is placed on Europe's growth by our failure to sort out the mechanics of the euro as a single currency is also a big problem for the European Union. It starts with the failure to recognize the scale of the financial crisis in Europe. It continues with this competitiveness issue that's got to be addressed by structural reforms, but it is also the failure to deal with the creation of the euro in a way that had a crisis prevention and a crisis resolution mechanism that could be brought on stream whenever a problem arose. That wasn't there, and that's why it is taking so long for so many countries with different national identities to come together to adopt a common policy on fiscal matters as well as on monetary matters. That's the essence of the problems that we face.
Yeah. As Chancellor of Exchequer, you engineered UK out of Europe. When you made the decision, there was not consensus, but you drove the process, and eventually you got it right. In retrospect, your judgment and decision, do you think it was right? And if it was right, then this undertaking in the name of Eurozone or single currency, was it pretty much your job? Was it too early to get it done back at that time?
Yeah, you're right, Ambassador. It was a very controversial decision in Britain. We are very much part of Europe, as you know. When you invest in Britain as Korean companies, you're investing in Britain as part of Europe because you can channel the whole of the European market from Britain. So we want to be part of the European Union. It is a huge 500 million people organization over time, and therefore it was a difficult decision for us to make not to join the single currency, because there were advantages. Of course, you have lower transaction costs, you have greater stability in the long run. If you can get this right, it can lead to higher growth if it works. I personally did not think it would work for us, and I wasn't sure that it was going to work for the rest of Europe. I felt that our economy was quite different in the way it was structured from the European economy, and there would be problems of convergence. I also thought Europe does not seem to have a way of dealing through the euro with any crisis that arises. There was no mechanism. Nobody was to be held responsible if something went wrong. There was no arrangement in the constitutional setup of the Europe for dealing with these crises. It does come back to this other issue. If countries with very distinctive national identities are coming together in a union of some kind, then there has to be some convergence between these countries. So in America, you've got states in America that are not nations but states, and the difference between the poorest and the richest state is relatively small. Not within the states where there's huge income inequalities, but between the poorest state, which may be Arkansas, Professor Kruger will tell you more accurately than me, the richer state, which may be, I don't know, New Hampshire, the differences are relatively small. In the United Kingdom, we have 4 nations, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales. The differences between the income per head of Scotland and England, they are very small. But the differences between the income per head of the richest European country, which is Luxembourg, and then Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, and the poorest countries, which are in Eastern Europe, are something like 5 to 1. So the poorest country has 20% of the income per capita of the richest country. Now, unless you have a mechanism by which these countries can converge with each other over time, there are bound to be resentments develop. And that is why you've got this problem with Greece and Germany. That's why you've got some of the problems within Spain at the moment. People feel that they're part of a union where they were going to catch up with the rest of Europe if they were one of the poorer countries, and they now find that how they were catching up in the last 10 years was by borrowing money, which is unsustainable, and there is no fiscal transfer mechanism to bridge the gap substantially over the next few years. So that is why you've got a series of resentments building up in Europe, because the promise of the Union was that incomes per head would grow in such a way that you had convergence between richest and poorest countries, and it may not be happening in the way that people imagined, and that will undoubtedly lead to further pressure for change.
On the occasion of 2009 London G20 summit, you pioneered the huge stimulus package in the amount of $1 trillion plus. That was rather epoch-making attempt on your part. With this, the global economy was salvaged from the morass. That is true. Now, if you look back, the whole process, which is still underway, this G20 process was the right thing to build up. And if you have any apprehension in terms of what it is doing, what it should be done, what should be done more, please let us know.
Well, let me applaud Korea's role in this in 2010, when you chaired the G20 here, and your president, I applaud what he sought to achieve in that meeting. In 2009, we had hoped that in addition to the boost to the world economy, there would be an agreement on growth for years to come. And we had hoped that we would pioneer an agreement on financial standards that were global and not just American, European, Korean, Chinese, and everything else. We'd hoped to get a global agreement. And my sadness is that that has not happened. And the world has retreated into what you might call individual national silos. So America and China are fighting each other over levels of currency at the moment, whereas I feel that we could have had an agreement on growth. Your president tried in 2010 to set a limit on trade surpluses and trade deficits, so that China would agree to have a limit to its surplus of 4%, and America would agree to have a limit on its deficit of 4%. And that was seen as one way of trying to get closer to an agreement about what might lead to greater growth without the instability of high surpluses and high deficits. But that agreement did not succeed. It did not work. I still say that because China can expand its consumer spending considerably and is too export-oriented as an economy at the moment, and because America and Europe could expand infrastructure investment if the private sector were prepared to mobilize funds for that purpose, that there is a basis on which we could have a global growth agreement in the next 2 or 3 years. The IMF actually did a calculation and found that if we did these things, global growth would be 3% higher after 3 years, 25 to 50 million more people would be in employment, and poverty would be reduced by anything up to 100 million if you could coordinate policies more successful. I'm absolutely sure that the lesson that we've got to learn for the future is if we all retreat into doing our own thing, no matter how good our individual national policies are, how good your innovation and education policy is, how good the American export strategy is, how good the Chinese attempt to rebalance their economy is and to spring the middle income trap, which you've done and they have yet to do, no matter how good these individual national policies are, in emphasizing science or technology or education or whatever, we all face a limit to our ability to succeed if we cannot cooperate more effectively internationally. And I would say that the biggest problems we face over the next few years are that there is no one country at the moment that really sees its interest. I'm talking about America or the European Union or China or India or yourselves. We need one country that sees its interests best furthered by pushing the world to achieve a higher level of cooperation. I suspect it can only happen now through the G20, and therefore that is the avenue. Russia is the chairman next year, then it's Australia, and then it's Turkey. We need countries prepared to push for a higher level of international cooperation if we're going to fulfill the potential that exists currently in the world economy.
With respect to the United States, at the moment, it is encountered with the so-called fiscal cliff.
It is a fiscal cliff.
Fiscal cliff. In your view, the U.S. can manage it well so that this crisis will be rather passed over, or the politics will play as a stumbling block, and therefore no solution will be found. And then what will happen? This is a big concern. How do you think it?
I think we should never forget that America has got wonderful technological genius, and its ability to develop new products and services is still something that will stand it in very good stead for many years to come. I think, however, that America has reached the limit to how much it can expand its consumer economy without being more successful at exporting to the rest of the world. And clearly the fiscal cliff illustrates that to expand its public sector, either public investment or current public spending, is difficult also given the high levels of debt and the high levels of borrowing. And so America should be looking to the world to export more to the world on the basis that if it were successful in exporting more, it would also be able to stimulate its own consumer spending at home. And I think if America recognized more effectively how much it was part of this global economy and how much its future depended on trade with this global economy, then it would want to see a trade agreement, which I'm afraid protectionist forces in the States are against, a world trade agreement, and the kind of global growth agreement I'm talking about. So when you look at an American election, obviously, and I don't want to comment on the candidates, and you've got these debates, there's not much about how America economically can recognize its greater interdependence in the world economy and how much it can work with the rest of the world to boost trade and then growth for future years. I think if that was part of the debate in America, then I think the world economy would benefit, and of course America would be embarked upon a strategy where it would want to see stronger growth agreements with China, India, Korea, as well, of course, as the trade agreement it now has with you at the moment.
Mr. Prime Minister, you seem to be uniquely positioned to preside over G20 finance ministers when Asian crisis erupted. And after that, when you became Prime Minister, U.S. financial crisis erupted, and you were there as chairperson of G20. These two unique opportunities gave you unique privilege to deal with this global crisis rather successfully. And for that, you deserve the credit. And if you see what really happened in the past and what you should see in the future, the linkage between the two crises, what is at the heart? What is missing here?
I think it's a recognition that we tend and have tended to ignore the dangers of financial instability when we look at the operation of our individual economies and the world economy. And you know, since the 1970s, all of us as economic ministers, indeed as businesses, we've all been worried about inflation. We've been worried about the cost of commodities, We've been worried about the effect of oil prices. You in Korea, with one of the biggest world importers of oil, you've been worried about the effect of commodity prices on your economy. And so we took lots of measures in the 1980s, 90s, and the beginning of the 21st century to combat the problem of inflation. And in most economies, we had dealt with that problem. We'd kept inflation low, we had a policy of inflation targeting, we had independent central banks. We created that in Britain as well as other countries did. And we felt satisfied that we'd done enough to prevent an upsurge of inflation being a huge threat to the possibilities of growth and employment. But we forgot, too many of us forgot, the dangers that come from financial instability. And again, if I'm looking to the future, we've got a surplus of savings around the world at the moment. One of the reasons is that people in Asia are saving, and one of the reasons is that we've got probably a lower level of infrastructure investment around the world than we should have had. So we've got a surplus of savings. By 2025, it's likely there will be a shortage of savings, because you will have the growing middle class in Asia wanting to spend on consumer goods. You've got the demographic pressures in Europe and America, where older people will be using up their savings to spend on their retirements. And so we may move from having a surplus of savings to a shortage of savings. We may have the inflation problems back. We may have higher interest rates as a result of that. In the meantime, however, this surplus of savings, we've got to find a way of managing this better than we're doing at the moment. And of course, in the early years of the 21st century, people were rushing after speculative gains from inappropriate and risky investments and really made huge mistakes. Starting from America, obviously, with the subprime crisis, but of course, it was true of European banks as well as it was of American financial institutions. So the lesson I've learned is you can have your focus on what seems to be the immediate problem, avoiding inflation, preventing the barriers to growth in that way. And then suddenly, because you have not taken all the steps that are necessary, you have a financial crisis in a new environment, which is a global economy rather than simply national economies. And we should now be doing far more to track the flow of money, to be sure where it is going, to have proper supervision when there are risky ventures at work, to monitor what's called the shadow banking system, to have proper standards of accountability. All these things, in my view, we will regret not taking the steps that are necessary, because no matter how hard you and I work, and no matter how hard the young children that we're talking about today train and educate themselves for the future, if their futures are to be blown aside because of a financial volatility that they are neither responsible for nor could have anticipated, then we who are decision makers have got a heavy responsibility that we've got to meet to avoid that kind of volatility for the future.
One last question, and that is about your new career. You've been appointed as UN Special Envoy for Global Education. Can you share your thoughts on this? This is your long-standing passion, as I understand.
I was incredibly impressed by what was said at the beginning of this morning's session when you heard speeches where people said, each of them, that education is the way to break the cycle of poverty. That if we're trying to prevent poverty moving from one generation to the next, we can do a number of things to alleviate problems, but the long-term way out of poverty is through education. And there is no better example and illustration of that for the world to see than the success of Korea over these last 50 years, when first you concentrated on improving primary education, then secondary education, then tertiary education, and now you're looking very carefully at vocational education and how that changes tertiary education, as well as reforms to create greater creativity and the critical faculties of children being developed in the schools. Now, today there are 61 million children around the world who in the year 2012 are not going to school. There are hundreds of millions of children leaving school, even although they have been there, who are still illiterate because the standard of teaching and the provision of education in many countries is so poor. I would like to see us meeting the Millennium Development Goal, which was set in 2000, and it said that by 2015, every single child should be at school. And I would like to see governments and businesses, and this is my role from the Secretary General, who is one of your fellow countrymen and who believes passionately, because of his own experience, in receiving help to get his education in Korea, that we should do more for these children around the world who need that help. And I would like to see Korea joining a global fund for education, where we could fast-track support to individual countries who want to make the effort to get all their children into school, but don't yet have the money, the teachers, or the infrastructure, the buildings to do so. And if we could fast-track that money and achieve by the end of 2015 that goal that every child be at school, then we are not only doing something for human rights and for civility in societies where the lack of education breeds discontent and in some cases civil unrest, but we're also doing a huge amount for opportunity and for economic development in a way that I believe no other policy can do. You have shown the way. Education really matters, and I believe that that is a message that the rest of the world should adopt very quickly if we're to give children opportunity and to give the economies that are lagging the chance to catch up and deliver better living standards and quality of life for their citizens. So I applaud what you're doing, and I hope that you'll be prepared and willing as companies and as government to help the global initiative to get every child to school.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. We wish you well, and we're going to conclude our discussion.
네, 고든 브라운 총리님, 이태식 고문님 대단히 감사드립니다. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Yes, sir.
네, 두 번째 기조연설자로는 다니엘 샤피로 하버드대 협상학 교수님을 연사로 모시고 설득, 소통하는 인재, 세상을 바꾸는 협상을 주제로 강연을 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 네, Professor Shapiro, please.
Thank you. And 안녕하세요. It is an honor and a real privilege to be here today. I want to first say a very warm and deep thank you to Prime Minister Kim, to Mr. Kim, President of Korea Economic Daily, all of you who are here today. I very much appreciated the comments that were just shared with Mr. Brown as well. In particular, talking about the importance of education. I think there are two different kinds of education, at the very least. One is educating people about the facts and the figures, the memorization, as your minister shared earlier. The second element of education is how do you actually deal with people? It's one thing, for example, in government to develop good policy, good economic policy, good social policy. It's a very different challenge trying to put those policies into action. So my talk today is going to focus in particular on how do you deal with some of those human elements of negotiation. The talk is going to be drawing upon some of the work that we've built over many years at the Harvard Negotiation Project, and also more recently in a project we're working on with the World Economic Forum, building a global curriculum on conflict management, on negotiation, for top-level business leaders and top-level political leaders as well. Equipping these leadership with a common set of tools to deal more effectively with negotiation and difference. One final point on this, my vision long-term, the image I have in my mind is just to imagine if every single kid in our world, as they go through schooling, learn skills of conflict resolution and negotiation. What would our world look like? And as I was thinking about the reflections for today, I've been, of course, watching very carefully the news of what's been happening in this region, the tensions that you're dealing with in terms of South Korea, North Korea, the balloon issue that just happened yesterday. Been watching very closely the islands issue as well. And I couldn't help but think about a situation that you know about much better than I do. Situation that happened in 1976. Right at that border between North and South Korea, not far from here. And there was a poplar tree, and I'm sure many of you will recall the situation. But this poplar tree, every year it would blossom and it would grow, and it would block the South Koreans' view of the bridge of no return. So out each year came some of your colleagues, and they went out to trim this tree for security purposes. And this was fine, year after year after year, until August 6th, 1976, when some of the South Korean team went out to trim the tree, and they were met soon by a North Korean contingency who said, "You try and trim this tree, we're going to shoot." And they literally chased away the South Korean team. But this did not stop the South Korean team from trying to trim this tree. This was a security concern. And as you will recall, about 2 weeks later, August 18th, 1976, came along a much larger team of South Korean soldiers, UN officials, and some US soldiers as well, and all there to trim this tree. And they're trimming for about 10 or so minutes, according to what records we've been able to find, and then along comes the North Korean contingency. Lieutenant from the North Korean side walks up to leadership from the South Korean side. "You try and trim this tree, we're going to shoot. We are going to shoot to kill." And as many of you in this room will recall, this turned into a bloody, bloody, terrible situation. There were a number of South Koreans who were injured in this incident. There were a number of North Koreans who were injured. And in fact, there were 2 US soldiers as well. Not just shot, decapitated. Heads chopped off, caught on camera, broadcast around the world. I was presenting this case a couple of years back at my home institution in the United States, and afterward, there was a gentleman that came up to me as I'm walking out of the room. He came up as angry as you can imagine. His face was red. "Professor Shapiro, I don't think you understand. I don't think you understand. I was there. I was at West Point at the US military college at that point in time. I knew those boys," meaning the Americans who were killed. "I knew their families. We were not just feeling grief at the loss of our soldiers," he says. "We were feeling utter, utter humiliation at the way our soldiers died." And surprise, surprise, this situation then reaches the highest of the high in the United States, the White House, where then President Ford was faced with a very difficult decision. What do you do? What do you do in this circumstance? And you face this day in and day out still. What do you do? And he turns to his lead advisor, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and asks Kissinger advice. What do we do? And according to what records we've been able to find, Kissinger's response, "Well, you know what I think we should do, Mr. President?" "No, what do you think we should do?" "I think we should bomb the North Koreans." And President Ford thinks about it and decides that a more appropriate strategy would be to simply try to cut down this tree. And thus began what is formally known in US military doctrine as Operation Paul Bunyan, named after this folklore hero in the United States, a big guy who chops down trees. Back to the scene now, very close to here, 813 manpower, 813 people. They're a 30-person armed platoon, ROK forces, trained in Taekwondo, F-5 fighters, 3 B-52 bombers circling around overhead with the single purpose of what? Of what? Of trying to cut down this tree. And did they do it? Yes. How long did it take? About 1 hour. Was there incident, any further bloodshed? No. But this was literally World War III, almost. And over what? Over a tree? And obviously it's over much, much more than just a tree. And it begs that fundamental question. As you are negotiating, whether it is in the military or political realm, whether it is in the business realm, whether it is with you and your family members negotiating, how do you deal with the emotional dimension? How do you deal with your emotions? And how do you deal with the emotions of other people? So that's what I'll be talking about in our short time together. So the big question again, as you negotiate, how should you deal with emotions? And our work at the Harvard Negotiation Project and our international negotiation program, we really now have been working around the world with leadership of business, leadership from the political realm, dating back to 1978, 1979, offering the process advice that President Carter used at the successful Camp David negotiation. Our organization was there in the early 1990s working with Mandela, the African National Congress, the government. We continue to do a lot of work around the world, And one of the crucial questions we've seen as you negotiate, how do you deal with the emotional dimension? And it's not an easy question, in part because there are so many emotions. I mean, just thinking yesterday, and I'm an outsider to Korea, but I felt it as the balloons were floating from one side to the other. I could feel some of the tension. There are a lot of emotions. How do you negotiate in a very politically tense situation where life and limb are on the line? A lot of emotions. Your personal emotions, group emotions, each side, the international community's emotions. How are you supposed to deal with all of these emotions as there are people sitting at the negotiation table trying to talk? And from my perspective, this is overwhelming. Too many emotions, too many causes of emotions in any negotiation. I mean, even if it's my wife and I trying to figure out where should we take our kids for Friday night for dinner. She says Indian, I say no, Korean food. Even there, a lot of emotions, frustration, annoyance, pride, curiosity, resentment. How do you deal with all of these emotions when dealing with important issues? And our suggestion is to say, don't focus on all of those different emotions as you are negotiating. Instead, turn your attention one step back to a handful of things that we call core concerns. Matters that are important to all of us. And by understanding these 5 core concerns and how to deal with them effectively in a negotiation, it can bring you power. Power in your negotiation. And so I'm going to walk briefly through 3 of these core concerns today so that you have some sense of what they are and how you might utilize them, whether in the business context or in the political context, or if you're like me with your family as well. So let's start with the first of these 5 core concerns, appreciation. Now, you have known, I'm sure, since you were the size of my children, they're 5, 7 years old, we all know that appreciation is a core concern. No one likes to feel not understood, devalued, put down. But it's only been recently that science has really started to catch up with our common understanding of just how powerful appreciation is. Anybody in this room newly married? Anybody newly married? Huh, you're newly married? No, okay, anybody else? We have one person who's newly. Nobody else? How long have you been married for? Just over a year. Okay, you're sort of a newlywed. And is your spouse here as well today? Sorry, is your spouse here? No, she's not here today. That'll make this interesting now. Well, and what's your first name? Henry. Okay. So, there are people, scientists, who study people like Henry. They study newlyweds. And they bring these newlyweds into laboratories. And not just any kind of laboratory. Even in the research literature, they call these laboratories the love lab. So in walks Henry and his spouse into the love lab. And immediately you're hooked up to all different kinds of devices, measuring blood pressure, physiological arousal, facial expression, body language, all of it. And you're sitting comfortably with your spouse on a couch. In walks a research assistant, young college student, who says to you and your spouse, for the next 15 minutes, I'd like the 2 of you to talk about a recent conflict that you have had. You don't need to argue, you don't need to fight about it, just talk about it. Has anybody tried to talk with your romantic partner about a recent conflict without getting back into the conflict? No, okay. Yes, I've actually tried this experiment with my wife, trying to talk about an issue without getting back into the issue, and what do you think happens? You get back into that issue, and very, very quickly. These research laboratories are able to predict with over 90% accuracy who stays married, who gets divorced, 1 year later, 3, 5, 10 years down the line. 10 years. And based only upon 1 minute, 30 seconds of observation. And guess what the primary predictor is of marital stability over time? What do you think it is? Appreciation. And they've boiled it down to a ratio, 5-to-1. Those couples that tend to last over time, as they are talking about their conflict, there are 5 appreciative statements. 5, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. For every single, but I think you're such a jerk. 5-to-1. Those couples that do not last, the ratio is different. The ratio there is actually 1-to-1. 1 appreciative statement for every negative statement. And when reading this research, what struck me is that the problem is not with the negative. The problem is with the lack of positive. And they have replicated this research, changing the methodology within the business context, teamwork context, and surprise, surprise. One of the major reasons that organizations tend to fail, that teams do not work as well as they could, people do not feel appreciated. And I thought to bring this to life, we might talk about an actual situation. Appreciation seems so nice and easy until you put it into the realm of real conflict situations. So part of the work I do is in hostage negotiation, crisis negotiation, and I've worked for some time with the New York Police Department's hostage negotiation team. Thought I might talk briefly about a case based upon a real-life situation. Basic situation. There was a gentleman, about 26 years old, clearly suffering from schizophrenia, delusions of grandeur. He thought he was better than God, so psychological problems. And he's in New York City, in the subway system, on a platform there. And he's just wandering around. And as he's wandering around, he sees a woman. Sees a woman about 20 years old, carrying a baby in her arms. And he sees the woman, he runs up to the woman, he grabs the baby out of her arms, pushes the woman into the train track, runs off into the janitor's closet, locks the door behind him, and the NYPD, the police department, they are called. And they get there about 5-10 minutes later, and they hear on the other side of the door, if this child is an angel, I will love him. If this child is a demon, you know what I need to do. If this child is an angel, I will love him. If this child is a demon, and banging. We're banging on the other side of the door. Open up, open up, open up. What's going on in there? And does our approach work? Yes or no? What do you think? No, of course not. We are approaching this situation like interrogators. You tell us what we need to know. And did it work? No. It only escalated the situation. And it went on. If this child is an angel, I will love him. If this child is a demon, you know what I have to do if this child is an angel. And then all of a sudden, one of the hostage negotiators said, don't worry, the child is an angel. The child's an angel. And did that work? What do you think? Unfortunately, not. Angel, angel, angel. How do you know? How do you know this child's an angel? And all of a sudden, we had now made precisely the opposite error that we had made several hours earlier. Because prior, we were completely failing to appreciate the interrogator. And now we are way on this other side of appreciation, assuming we know more about what that hostage negotiator wants than he does. And that is a dangerous place to be. And it wasn't until we went back to the very basics of what I believe to be the essence of good negotiating, listening, asking good questions, that we actually got somewhere. We learned that this hostage negotiator, from his perspective, he was not crazy. He was trying to save the world. That was his mindset. He was trying to save the world. And once we understood that, it changed our complete approach to the negotiation. Because now we could say, look, I'm the police department. I don't see the angels you see. I don't see the demons you see. But I hear you saying you are trying to save the world. And in our own small way here at the police department, We are trying to save the world too. So why don't you open up that door and let's see if we can try and save this world together. And literally, 3 minutes later, that door squeaks open, out walks gentleman with baby in arms. But it was that challenge. How do you truly appreciate in those moments of tension where appreciation is the last thing in the world you feel like doing? So that's appreciation. For sake of time, let me move on quickly to autonomy. Autonomy, the way we define it, it's the freedom to make decisions without somebody else telling you what to do. The moment your neighbors on any of the sides around you start to feel like you are telling them what to do, and their autonomy starts to feel impinged, they have the negative emotions, and they're less likely to cooperate with you. And just as true, the moment that you start feeling like your autonomy is being impinged by them, in come your negative emotions, all of that history from the past, and you're less likely to cooperate with them. So how do you try to respect autonomy, each side, to make the negotiation work more effectively, to bring positive emotions into the negotiation to the extent you can? And let me close today with one final brief case study on the topic of our third core concern, affiliation. So affiliation is the emotional connection between you and another person, another group. And in negotiation, people often assume, well, if we're negotiating, we're adversaries. In the business realm, if we're negotiating, we must be against one another. In the political realm, if we have a disagreement, we are adversaries. And my response to that is no. Difference is not the same as confrontation. You can deal with difference in many different kinds of ways. And the big question to get the full value out of negotiation, how do you turn an adversary into a colleague? How do you turn an adversary into an ally? And let me close with one case study. There was a long-standing conflict between Peru and Ecuador. The conflict was largely over a small piece of land called Tawinsa, right at the border between the two countries. And the US State Department had called this conflict the longest-standing armed conflict in the history of the Western Hemisphere. A number of international figures had tried to help deal with the situation: the King of Spain, President Roosevelt from the United States, and others, but all unsuccessful. 1998, Jamil Mahuad was elected president of Ecuador. And he decided that his first order of business was going to be to try to create peace between Peru and Ecuador. And just as a side note, this was 1998, and Ecuador, just like parts of Asia, was tremendously affected by the economic crisis at that point in time. And it turns out that President Mahuad had been a student of my colleagues, Roger Fisher's. President Mahuad had been a student of mine a number of years later. He calls up our organization and says, look, I am about to meet with President Fujimori of Peru in just 3 days. I'd love your advice. When I go to sit down and talk with President Fujimori, what do I say? Practically, what do I do? This is not an academic case study, professors. This is real. And the question was, what is the advice? And we were drawing upon these kinds of ideas. Let me share with you 2 pieces of advice, and then I'll close the talk. One piece of advice was to ask advice. Rather than having President Mahuad walk in and say to President Fujimori, here's our position, what's your position? That hadn't worked. For many years, that approach had not worked. The idea was to actually say, look, President Fujimori, what's your practical advice? You've been a president for 8 years. You've worked with 4 of my predecessors. I've been a president for 3 days. What's your advice on how we can realistically deal with this conflict? And you know I cannot simply go back to my Congress and say, we're going to do everything Peru wants. My Congress will never ratify that. What's your realistic advice? And simply by asking that question of advice, it turned these two presidents from adversaries facing one another to colleagues, working side by side on a shared problem. And this is something you can do every day in business, in the government realm. What's your advice? How do we get out of this mess that we are in right now? And maybe it's a formal question, or as with dealing with neighbors, maybe the advice is a question that you're asking in very private corners. Second piece of advice that we offered, this was my colleague, Professor Fisher, who unfortunately just passed away about a month and a half ago. But Professor Fisher said to President Mahmoud, I want a picture. Get the cameras there. I want a picture of you and President Fujimori. And President Mahmoud said, that's fine. There'll be plenty of cameras there. We'll get a nice, stately picture of the two of us shaking hands. And Professor Fisher said, no. That's not the kind of picture I want. I want a picture of the two of you sitting side by side, pads of paper in hand, pens in hand. Why? As much as these two presidents build a relationship, the challenge was, how do you get the peoples to change their perspectives about the conflict? And this was one suggestion on how to do so. President Mahmoud said, fine, I'll try my hardest, Professor, see if I can get that picture. And to his credit, President Mahmoud did try to get that picture. Came back about a week later, and this picture was on the cover of the Ecuadorian newspaper. And you'll see President Mahmoud on your left, President Fujimori on your right, and this picture had a dramatic impact on the entire peace process. Because now the peoples of both sides saw we are no longer adversaries working against one another. We are now colleagues working side by side on shared problems. 77 days later, 10 meetings later, full binding agreement between the two sides that stands to this day. Both of these leaders at that point in time in 1998 were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their effort. But to me, what I would love to leave you with is just that image of people working side by side on very difficult, very challenging situations. I'm not saying that the advice I'm talking about, the specific advice today, is precisely what will work here in the region. What I am ultimately saying is that emotions are tremendously important in the negotiation process. And you can choose how you want to deal with those emotions. You can respect one another's core concerns, and you get the positive emotions. You get people who are working effectively together. On the other hand, you can deal poorly with these core concerns, putting people, not appreciating others, disrespecting their autonomy, telling them what to do rather than consulting, failing to build that affiliation, and again, you get predictable but much more dangerous consequences. So it's with that I just want to say a warm and deep thank you. I've learned a tremendous amount during my short time here so far. I look forward to continued conversation, continued learning, and as Mr. Brown had said earlier, I fully concur. Korea is absolutely an inspiration to myself as well. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro, for your energetic lecture. 네, 다니엘 샤피로 교수님 대단히 감사합니다. 네, 이번 기조연설은 설득, 소통하는 인재, 세상을 바꾸는 협상에 대해서 알아볼 수 있는 아주 귀중한 시간이었습니다. 기조연설을 위해서 방한해 주신 고든 브라운 전 영국 총리님, 그리고 다니엘 샤피로 하버드대 협상학 교수님, 그리고 좌장으로 수고해 주신 이태식 SK에너지 고문님께 대단히 감사하다는 말씀을 다시 드릴게요. 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. Thank you for your time with us, Mr. Brown and Professor Shapiro. 네, 그럼 이상으로 기조연설 순서를 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. you.